There exists a chamber within the human heart that remains sealed until the moment when pain crosses its threshold. Not the superficial pain of daily inconveniences, but that which tears the veil of illusion and forces us to confront the abyss dwelling beneath the surface of our carefully ordered lives. It is in this instant of rupture, when the world we once knew crumbles like ash in our hands, that the true alchemical journey begins. The ancient masters of the Hermetic art understood a truth that modernity insists on forgetting. Suffering is not a cosmic accident to be avoided at all costs, but the essential raw material of interior transformation. In the alchemical tradition, before the philosophical gold could emerge, the adept needed to descend into the phase of Nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the symbolic death of everything they believed themselves to be. Without this voluntary descent into the personal inferno, no transmutation would be possible. Rumi, the mystic poet of Konya, expressed this truth with crystalline clarity when he wrote of wounded love opening portals to the divine. In his words, pain is the hammer that breaks open the locked chest of the ego, allowing the light hidden within to finally radiate outward. But this understanding was not born in a vacuum. It is heir to a millennial lineage that traverses Persian Sufism, Jung's depth psychology, and the Neoplatonic mysteries of antiquity. What happens when we recognize that each wound carries an encrypted message? When we understand that suffering is neither divine punishment nor cruel chance, but an invitation whispered by the soul itself for us to become what we were always destined to be. This is not an answer that can be given lightly. It demands that we sit in the darkness, that we listen to the groans of the self that is dying, and that we have the courage to ask, what does this suffering want to teach me that my superficial happiness could never reveal? The question itself is already an act of alchemy. To ask it is to refuse the modern tyranny of positivity, the cultural imperative that insists all negative emotions must be medicated, therapized, or dissolved through mindfulness apps and self-help platitudes. The alchemical perspective recognizes something our ancestors knew intimately, but we have largely forgotten, that the human soul is forged not in the warmth of comfort, but in the crucible of what breaks us open. Consider for a moment the architecture of your own life. How many of your deepest insights, your most authentic relationships, your truest expressions of self emerged from periods of ease and satisfaction? And how many were born from the fertile soil of loss, failure, heartbreak, or existential crisis? This is not to romanticize suffering or to suggest we should seek it out masochistically. Rather, it is to acknowledge what the mystics and depth psychologists have long known, that pain, when met consciously rather than evaded desperately, becomes the prima materia of psychological and spiritual gold. Carl Gustav Jung, the physician of souls who dared to map the unexplored territories of the human psyche, dedicated his life to understanding what he called the process of individuation, the journey by which a human being becomes truly whole. But Jung did not invent this idea from nothing. He was a conscious heir to the Western Hermetic tradition and the Eastern mystics who recognized pain as the supreme pedagogue. In Jungian psychology, suffering plays a fundamental role. It is the herald of the shadow, that rejected portion of ourselves that lives exiled in the unconscious. When life strikes us with losses, betrayals, illnesses, or failures, it is not the universe being malevolent. It is the shadow knocking at the door of consciousness, demanding recognition. Jung observed that his most tormented patients were frequently those who had constructed unilateral identities, refusing to integrate the unacceptable aspects of their natures. The shadow, however, is not merely the repository of personal evil. It also contains undeveloped potentials, repressed talents, and the vital energy that was sacrificed on the altar of social conformity. When we suffer intensely, it is because this damned energy is exploding through the fissures of our persona, the social mask we wear to navigate the world. Suffering, then, is simultaneously destruction and revelation. The medieval alchemists, laboring in their smoke-filled laboratories, were not actually trying to transform lead into metallic gold. That was merely the coded language they used to describe psychic transformation. The opus Alchemicum, the great work, was the transmutation of the raw matter of ordinary human existence into the philosophical gold of illuminated consciousness. And the first stage, the Nigredo, was necessarily a phase of suffering and dissolution. In this black phase, the alchemists placed the materia prima in the crucible and applied the purifying fire. Everything that was impure, false, or built on unstable foundations needed to be burned away. Psychologically, this corresponds to the moment when our illusions are shattered, when we discover that the marriage was a farce, that the career brings no fulfillment, that our self-image was a consoling lie. This blackening is painful precisely because we are witnessing the death of an obsolete self. But here lies the central paradox. This death is not the end, but the portal to rebirth. The Persian Sufis, particularly in the tradition of fana, annihilation, and baka, subsistence, understood that the individual ego needed to be dissolved in the presence of the divine beloved before true existence could begin. The poet Attar narrated this journey in his masterpiece, The Conference of the Birds, where 30 birds traverse 7 valleys of suffering and trial, only to discover that the king they sought, Simurgh, was themselves reflected in the mirror of divine unity. Jung found in alchemical and mystical texts a confirmation of what he observed clinically. Suffering that is not avoided, but consciously confronted and integrated, transforms into the energy that propels the individuation process. It is not pain itself that transforms us, but our conscious relationship with it. When we remain present in the furnace of suffering, when we refuse to flee through distractions, addictions, or denial, something remarkable happens. We begin to perceive patterns, to hear messages, to recognize the hand of the soul itself, orchestrating the collapse of what we were so that we might become who we are. This is where Jung's genius truly reveals itself. He recognized that the psyche possesses an inherent drive toward wholeness, what he called the self, the totality of conscious and unconscious elements organized around a central ordering principle. This self is not the ego, that small conscious identity we mistakenly believe ourselves to be, but something far vaster and more mysterious. The self uses suffering as one of its primary tools to shatter the ego's rigid structures and force an expansion of consciousness. Think of it this way. The ego is like a small, well-defended castle that believes itself to be the entire kingdom. It constructs walls, maintains order, and excludes anything that threatens its sense of control and coherence. But the self is the entire kingdom. The castle, yes, but also the dark forests, the wild rivers, the dragons in the caves, the treasures buried underground. Suffering is the self's way of forcing the castle to acknowledge the kingdom, to expand its walls until they encompass the totality of what we are. The alchemists understood this with remarkable precision. Their texts are filled with images of death and rebirth, of dissolution and coagulation, of the reconciliation of opposites. The Rosarium Philosophorum, a seminal alchemical text that Jung analyzed extensively, depicts a series of images showing the death and resurrection of the king and queen. Symbolic representations of consciousness and the unconscious, engaging in a sacred marriage that produces the divine child, the integrated self. First station. The encounter with the primordial wound. Every alchemical journey begins not with choice, but with necessity. The traveler does not consciously decide to descend into the underworld. They are pushed by circumstances that exceed their capacity for control. It might be the sudden death of a loved one, a betrayal that shatters trust, an illness that robs the illusion of invulnerability, or simply the gradual awakening to the existential void that lurks beneath the surface of modern life. Rumi tells the story of a man who, while digging a well in search of water, pierces the ceiling of a subterranean chamber where an immense dragon had slept for centuries. Terrified, the man attempts to seal the opening again, but it is too late. The dragon has awakened and now demands recognition. This is the nature of the primordial wound. Once exposed, it cannot be ignored again. The initial suffering is the revelation that something deep and powerful in our psyche is clamoring for attention. Jung would identify this dragon as a content of the collective unconscious, an autonomous complex with a life of its own that has been constellated by external circumstances. The individual's role at this stage is not to destroy the dragon, but to establish a dialogue with it. What is the nature of this wound? Where does it come from? What does it want? This is not an intellectual exercise. The wound announces itself through the body, through dreams, through the collapse of meaning structures that previously held life together. A successful executive suddenly finds himself unable to get out of bed, paralyzed not by physical illness, but by a profound sense that his entire life has been a performance for an audience that doesn't exist. A devoted mother discovers that her children's departure from home has revealed a terrifying absence at her core, an identity so thoroughly defined by caregiving that without it she doesn't know who she is. These moments of rupture are initiatory in nature. In the ancient mystery schools, initiates underwent rituals of symbolic death and rebirth. The modern psyche still requires initiation, but in the absence of cultural containers for this process, the psyche creates its own initiations through suffering. The wound is the call to adventure that the hero's journey always begins with, the summons that cannot be refused. Second station, the dissolution of the ego, solutio. Following the initial impact comes a period of dissolution. In alchemical terminology, this is called solutio, the process of liquefaction where solid structures become fluid. Psychologically, this is the moment when the ego's defenses begin to crumble. The carefully constructed identity reveals itself as a cardboard structure that cannot withstand the deluge of authentic suffering. Many seek escape at this point. Alcohol, compulsive work, destructive relationships, consumerism, all are desperate attempts to avoid dissolution. But the mystics warn us, resistance only prolongs the torment. There is a Sufi parable about a man who, while drowning in the ocean, fights frantically against the waves until, exhausted, he finally surrenders and discovers that the water supports him. This surrender is perhaps the most counterintuitive act demanded by the alchemical process. Everything in our cultural conditioning tells us to fight, to maintain control, to stay strong. But the solutio requires a different kind of strength, the courage to let go, to allow what needs to die, to trust that dissolution is not annihilation, but transformation. Jung observed in his patients that those who attempted to overcome suffering quickly through willpower or positive thinking frequently ended up developing more severe symptoms. The psyche, when denied its need for mourning and transformation, manifests through physical symptoms, compulsions, or even more dramatic later collapses. The solutio demands conscious surrender, not passive capitulation, but an active acceptance of the necessity to come undone. During this phase, the individual often experiences what mystics call the desert or the dark night. Nothing brings pleasure. Old interests feel hollow. Relationships that once sustained now feel like burdens. This is not clinical depression in the medical sense, though it may present with similar symptoms. It is a necessary emptying, a clearing of the psychological landscape so that new growth becomes possible. The alchemists spoke of the necessity of reducing the matter to its prima materia, its first matter, before any transformation could occur. You cannot build a new structure on a faulty foundation. First, the foundation must be revealed, examined, and if necessary, completely reconstructed. This is the terrifying and necessary work of the solutio. Third station, the encounter with the shadow. At the heart of dissolution, an inevitable encounter awaits, the confrontation with the shadow. This is not an abstract experience, but profoundly visceral. The shadow manifests in countless forms, as the horrifying perception of our own hidden selfishness, as the murderous rage we denied possessing, as the desire for vengeance we considered beneath us, or as the fragility and dependency our strong persona denied. There is a story in Sufi traditions about Majnun, the mad lover, who searched for his beloved Layla everywhere, even crawling through dirt and the darkest alleys of the city. When someone asked him why he searched in the most shadowy places when Layla was pure light, Majnun responded, "I search where there is enough light to see. But perhaps it is in the dark places that I will finally find her, for there she may be hidden from my eyes blinded by hope." Jung would use this story to illustrate that the self, our psychological totality, can only be found when we consciously integrate what we reject. The shadow is not the enemy, but the gatekeeper guarding the treasures of the unconscious. Each quality we deny in ourselves contains imprisoned psychic energy. When we finally recognize, for example, that we are capable of cruelty, this perception does not make us cruel. It makes us conscious and therefore capable of genuine choice. The shadow encounter often begins with projection. We see in others what we cannot acknowledge in ourselves. The qualities that most irritate us in other people are frequently disowned aspects of our own psyche. The self-righteous person who rails against hypocrisy is often unconscious of their own double standards. The person who condemns weakness in others is typically fleeing from their own vulnerability. Jung's method of shadow integration involved what he called active imagination, a technique of consciously dialoguing with the figures that emerge from the unconscious. Rather than trying to suppress or eliminate shadow content, the practitioner engages it in conversation, asks it questions, attempts to understand its perspective and its needs. This is not the same as acting out shadow impulses, but rather bringing them into conscious awareness where they can be understood and integrated, rather than possessed by. The Persian mystic Hafiz wrote, "The heart is a 1,000-stringed instrument that can only be tuned with love." The shadow, terrifying as it may appear, ultimately wants to be included, to be seen, to be integrated into the wholeness of the self. Its destructive power comes not from its nature, but from being exiled and denied. Fourth station, the alchemical marriage, Coniunctio. After the encounter and integration of the shadow, a new possibility emerges, the union of opposites. In alchemical iconography, this is represented by the sacred marriage between the Red King and the White Queen, between the sun and the moon, between the conscious masculine and the unconscious feminine. Psychologically, Jung identified this as the integration of the anima in men, or the animus in women, the contrasexual aspects of the psyche that carry our capacity for relationship with the unconscious. Suffering, when worked with consciously, reveals itself as the crucible where this union becomes possible. A man who suffers a devastating loss may, for the first time, contact his vulnerability, his tears, his need for connection, all qualities he previously relegated to the feminine and therefore unacceptable to his masculine identity. A woman who faces betrayal may discover her indomitable strength, her capacity to establish boundaries, her righteous anger, aspects that her socialization taught her to repress. Saadi of Shiraz, another master of the Persian word, wrote about the gardener who, in caring for his roses, also needed to coexist with thorns. He did not try to have roses without thorns, for he understood that beauty and pain grow from the same stem. This is the wisdom of the Coniunctio. It is not about eliminating pain to achieve joy, or eradicating darkness to have light, but recognizing that both are faces of the same integrated reality. The Coniunctio is perhaps the most mysterious and transformative phase of the alchemical work. It represents the moment when consciousness and the unconscious, having been separated and purified through the earlier stages, come together in a new synthesis. This is not a return to the original unconscious unity of childhood, but a higher-order integration that maintains the achievements of consciousness while incorporating the depths of the unconscious. In practical terms, this manifests as a profound shift in how we relate to our inner life. Instead of seeing thoughts and emotions as either good, to be encouraged, or bad and to be suppressed, we begin to see them as information, as expressions of a psyche that is constantly seeking balance and wholeness. The anxious thought is not an enemy to be defeated, but a signal that something needs attention. The surge of anger is not a moral failing, but energy that, when consciously directed, can fuel necessary boundary setting or creative action. Fifth station, the birth of the self. The final product of the alchemical great work is not sterile perfection, but what Jung called the self, the ordering center of the total psyche, conscious and unconscious. This self is not the inflated ego that proclaims, "I have overcome my suffering," but a deeper and quieter presence that observes both pain and joy with equanimity. The Sufis describe this as the state of baqa, subsistence after annihilation. The one who has passed through fana, through the death of the separate ego, is reborn into a state of more authentic existence. It is not that suffering magically disappears, but that the relationship with it transforms completely. What was once an oppressive tyrant becomes a respected teacher. In Jung's vision, the self manifests through symbols of totality, the circle, the mandala, the philosopher's stone. But its most reliable sign in daily life is a sense of purpose that does not depend on external circumstances. Those who have completed this alchemical journey through suffering carry a quality difficult to define, a simultaneous presence of gravity and lightness, of recognition of the world's pain, and an inexplicable joy that emerges from the depths. This is not the happiness promised by consumer culture or positive psychology. It is something older, deeper, more durable. It is what the ancient Greeks called eudaimonia, not hedonic pleasure, but the flourishing that comes from living in accordance with one's deepest nature, one's daimon. It is what Viktor Frankl, survivor of Auschwitz, discovered in the concentration camps. That meaning can be found even in the most extreme suffering, and that this meaning transforms suffering from something unbearable into something that, paradoxically, confirms rather than negates the value of existence. It would be dishonest to paint the alchemical journey as a linear and inevitable progression. There are moments, particularly in the heart of the Nigredo, where the traveler faces not just pain, but the temptation of total nihilism, the conviction that everything is meaningless, that suffering leads nowhere, that the promise of transformation is just another consoling lie. This is what Christian mystics called the dark night of the soul, and alchemists knew as the phase of mortificatio, the complete death that precedes resurrection. Jung observed that many of his patients, particularly in midlife, faced this crisis where all the values and beliefs that had sustained their lives revealed themselves as empty. This is not common clinical depression, but an existential awakening that is simultaneously devastating and necessary. There is a story in Sufi traditions about a traveler lost in the desert who, after days without water, finally finds a well. Desperate, he descends to the bottom of the dark well using a fragile rope, only to discover that the well is dry. There, at the bottom of the empty well in total darkness, he has a vision. He perceives that the sky, which he could see only as a small circle through the well's opening, contained more stars than he had ever seen when he was on the surface. This parable captures the paradoxical nature of existential crisis. Sometimes we need to descend to the bottom of the empty well to see the stars. The suffering that deprives us of all superficial consolations can, if consciously endured, reveal dimensions of existence that were invisible when we were comfortably installed in our ordinary lives. Jung wrote extensively about what he called the confrontation with the unconscious, periods in his own life where the distinction between sanity and madness seemed perilously thin. What saved him was not denying the experience or medicating it into oblivion, but actively engaging with the images emerging from the unconscious through drawing, active writing, and internal dialogue. He understood that the psychic symptom is not the problem, but the psyche's attempt to heal itself, a coded message that needs to be deciphered. The crisis of the soul, then, is not a sign of failure, but of depth. It indicates that something in us refuses to accept superficial answers, that a deeper part is demanding authenticity at any cost. The challenge is not to eliminate the crisis, but to find means of remaining in it without being destroyed, to develop what alchemists called the vas hermeticum, the sealed vessel that can contain the tension of opposites without fragmenting. This is where many spiritual traditions and psychological approaches fail. They offer techniques to feel better quickly, to return to baseline functioning, to get over it and move on. But the alchemical perspective recognizes that some crises cannot and should not be resolved quickly. They are the labor pains of a new self being born, and premature intervention can abort the process. The Sufi poet Rumi wrote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." But we might add, the wound remains a wound while it is allowing the light to enter. There is no bypass, no shortcut. The only way through is through, as the saying goes, but this through requires a quality of presence and endurance that our culture rarely cultivates. Those who emerge from this alchemical journey are not the same as those who entered. Something fundamental has changed, not just in their superficial psychology, but in their basic ontology, in their way of being in the world. The Sufi masters describe this state as that of the arif, one who knows through direct experience, not through abstract concepts. The result is not the elimination of the capacity to suffer. The illuminated are not immune to pain. They simply no longer identify exclusively with it. They develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to maintain consciousness, even while oscillating between extreme emotional states, to observe their own psychic processes with curiosity instead of total identification. In alchemical language, the philosophical gold produced is not material for ostentation, but something that carries transmutative properties. The one who has passed through the great work becomes themselves an agent of transformation. Their presence has a catalytic effect on others who suffer, not because they offer superficial advice or quick solutions, but because they embody living proof that transmutation is possible. There is a specific quality in these people. They do not speak about their past sufferings with survivor's pride or victim's bitterness. Instead, there exists a quiet recognition that the pain was necessary, even sacred in its purpose. They do not wish to relive it, but they also would not deny it if they could go back in time, for they understand that without it, they would not be who they are. Jung noted that his most completely individuated patients, those who had successfully navigated the turbulent waters of the deep psyche, shared a common characteristic, a paradoxical relationship with life that embraced both its tragic aspect and its inexplicable beauty. They had developed what he called mana personality, not in the sense of supernatural powers, but of an interior authority that does not need to proclaim itself because it simply is. The final product of the alchemy of suffering is not conventional happiness, but something more valuable, meaning. Viktor Frankl, Auschwitz survivor and founder of logotherapy, observed that those who survived the concentration camps were not necessarily the physically strongest, but those who could find meaning even in the most extreme suffering. The human being can endure almost any how if they have a sufficiently powerful why. The final integration does not mark the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new relationship with life. The transformed individual understands that the great work is never completely finished, that there will be new cycles of death and rebirth, new descents into the Nigredo. But now, there exists a fundamental trust in the process, the certainty that suffering, when met consciously, always carries the seeds of transformation. This trust is not naive optimism. It is earned wisdom, forged in the crucible of experience. It is the knowledge that the psyche has an inherent drive toward wholeness, that symptoms are not enemies, but messages, that what appears as breakdown is often actually breakthrough. It is the recognition that we are not small, fragile egos at the mercy of a hostile universe, but expressions of something far vaster, what Jung called the self, what mystics call the divine, what alchemists knew as the one thing from which all things emerge and to which all things return. The crucible that forges the soul is not heated by the fire of comfort, but by the flames of what forces us to choose between fragmenting ourselves in evasions or forging ourselves into wholeness. And the gold that emerges does not shine to blind others, but to illuminate the path for those who still seek light in the depths of their own darkness. For in the end, every wound we consciously embrace becomes not a scar of shame, but a seal of initiation, marking us as those who dared to descend, and in descending, discovered that the treasure we sought in heaven was always buried in the earth of our own deepest suffering.